Hey guys, so we've got a new project that we're going to start this week and just see how long it takes to run its course. We picked up a 2015 Yamaha Viking. It's the 700cc engine with a dump bed 4x4. It's a side-by-side essentially. And we got it from a gentleman who's a few hours north of us. And he, wasn't interested in repairing it, and that's what it needs. Is it needs a fix. Right now it's got a piston sticking through the crankcase on the engine, so it's a blown engine. And I'm going to spend some time kind of investigating it to see if I can repair the engine with a new crankcase, or if it just is more economical to to replace the whole engine with like a remanufactured one or something from a parts machine on Facebook Marketplace. We're kind of excited about it. I think it'll be useful on our property. Up until this point, we've had a 1980s golf cart that it's worked pretty well for us, but as I mentioned in a previous video, the hills are pretty steep here, so it'd be nice to have something that has four-wheel drive. I did find a technical service manual for this side-by-side, so I think I've got a pretty good sense of what needs to happen to get the engine out, and we'll film it and kind of show you what's going on. And I'll try to tell you or point out any tips or tricks I come across along the way. When I picked up this unit a few days ago, the previous owner had started to tear it apart to get into it. I think he was probably turned off a little bit by the type of damage that he was seeing, and so that's why he was eager to sell it. But what he had done was that he had pretty well assembled or disassembled the bed off of it, as well as kind of the guards and things that held it in place. But essentially what it is the bed's held in place with a pair of pins on the rear end, and then it's got struts to hold it up into once it's elevated. There's a few heat shield pieces here, and then a bracket that would go over top of the engine. Inside of the cab, then there is an air box that he removed, so the air filter would sit in this location, and then we've got the throttle body there. So we've rinsed it out a little bit. There was a lot of mud and grit down here, but that's about it up until this point. In order to access the engine a little bit easier for removal further down the road, I'm taking out the rest of the exhaust system that was left by the previous owner. It's got a heat shield attached to these splash guards with some plastic rivets, like what you might see in car interiors. So I'm taking those out. And then from there, the rest of this exhaust is held on with 14mm bolts. So, typically I see 13 and 15 used on automotive things. This seems to be a 12 and 14. A little different, but at least it's all metric. Something I've been doing with previous projects that I have found pretty helpful is to reinsert the bolts that come out into their original locations. It's just easier to keep track of things as you've got a full teardown in progress. Other times is to review videos like this, or to use photos that I've taken of the chassis or whatever it is that I'm disassembling. Moving to the bottom side, I'm underneath the engine itself right now. There are 4 mounting blocks that secure the engine to the frame. Those were all 14mm. And then back on the inside here, I'm forward of the engine between the 2 front seats. This is the front drive shaft going up to the front diff. There's this yoke system or kind of a capturing system that holds a rubber bushing in place. So we're going to remove that to free that up a little bit. So coming back on the front side of the engine, there are these little rubber boots that go over top of the splines before the shaft goes into the engine. I like to pull these back just to expose things a little bit easier. And a lot of times for things, that have a splined interface like this, I'll take a magic marker and just do a quick tick mark on both the female and male end of it so that I can make sure things are properly aligned as they go back together. In some cases it doesn't matter, but it's easier to just place that rather than wish you did. So I had to come back to the front end of the side-by-side here. I'm looking at the front diff, and there's, I believe 3 or 4 different nuts and bolts holding this in place to the frame itself. I found these to be 15 millimeter and 17 millimeter nuts. And what I'm doing is I'm loosening up the diff from the frame in order to give myself a little bit more relaxation in the front drive shaft. What I had found previously was that, you know, there just wasn't enough wiggle room that I could slip the spline out of the front side of the engine. And so by doing this, by loosening the front diff, it allows me to get just enough extra wiggle room to get it free of the engine. So now that I've got the front end of the engine free of the drivetrain, I've moved to the rear of the unit. So this is the rear differential, and there's a real short drive shaft coming out of the back of the engine. So essentially the engine's got a transfer case kind of built into it, unlike your truck or car or something which might have a separate transfer case. Anyways, I'm working on this rear diff, getting it free of the engine, and doing this for the same reason that I did at the front. Just to give myself some wiggle room so that I can pull the engine free of the drive shaft and up and out of the chassis. So this is going to look a little redneck, but you know, when you're working by yourself, sometimes you got to find workarounds, especially if you're not an actual workshop. You know, I got to work with what I got my hands on. In previous videos, you've seen the John Deere 3520 that I've got on the property. I've got forks on the front of it this time. So I've got a ratchet strap tied around the main cylinder of the engine, and I'm slowly lifting it up and then checking that everything is free as I'm doing it. What I did notice is that there's an auxiliary coolant line that comes up and taps into a location right by the oil filter. So I had to detach that as I was working it up and out of the way. It was pretty inaccessible when it was down installed in the chassis, so something I'll have to keep in mind as I'm reassembling things. But it's kind of a slow and steady progress. You know, I lift it up a little bit, make sure everything's free, wiggle it free of anything that it could be hung up on, and then continue to lift it. In doing this, I mean, it's a pretty simple approach. Probably not OSHA approved, but it works for me. And now that I've got the chassis out of the way, I can lower it back down and onto the ground. So I guess we'll call it a wrap for today. Quick summary of what we got accomplished. We started by working on this front drive shaft where we had to disconnect that bushing bearing, the support in the middle there, to loosen up that end. And then we came around to the front and actually had to disconnect the front differential so that it could slide around in the frame somewhat to give ourselves the clearance that we needed to slide the whole system out of the front of the engine. And then proceeding to the rear, we did something similar. Obviously we made sure all the engine lines, electrical, oil, etc., air was disconnected previously. But we had to disconnect this rear differential as well so that it could slide somewhat in the frame. So right now the front and rear differentials are loose in the frame, but that gave us the play that we needed in order to get these splines out of the front of the and rear of the engine. So this being the rear and the front's up here. You probably saw we had the tractor out. We used the forks and some ratchet straps to lift it carefully out of the back. I did notice that I had missed one hose that was clipped on the bottom side, and that was looks like an auxiliary coolant, probably to a pump around the oil filter. I'll have to look into that. Something I missed, but luckily I got it disconnected before putting too much stress on the system. So the engine came out. We wheeled the side-by-side back into the garage, and I've got the engine then on just some rollers until I start digging into that. So this is the front of the unit, pretty clean looking, nothing too noteworthy. Coming around to the back side though, that's where that piston was starting to come through the crankcase. A little bit better picture of it now that we got it all free. So unfortunately that's pretty catastrophic failure there. I don't see that any of the auxiliary systems seem to be damaged. Like, it looks like our oil filter location and things seem to be okay. And I'm wondering if I can just get this main housing of the crankcase and kind of rebuild things that way. It'll be a little bit easier to tell once we've got it all apart and we're looking up into the cylinder to see if the piston, when it came free, if it really scored things. And then I'll just do a quick price breakdown on a spreadsheet or something to see if it makes more sense to buy all the pieces individually or get something, you know, remanufactured on eBay. Obviously, I'll be using a lot of these other parts that likely won't come on the engine that I purchase if that's the route I go. But nevertheless, it's out of the side-by-side. It'll make it a little bit easier for me to clean up some of this other stuff that was behind here. You can see I still got some screws and things that look like they popped free of the engine. Yeah, you know, we'll try to get this cleaned up a little bit so it's a little bit nicer to work on. Anyways, like I said, that's enough for today. It's getting dark. The cicadas are coming out. And we'll catch you on the next one. Have a good one.